Did you know you can't copyright a chord progression? We transcribed 350 famous chord progressions from the last 15 years of electronic music, and you can download them for free to use as a starting point in your next song. Today we're going to show you 6 ways to take these famous chord progressions and make them your own. So let's just jump right into it. But first, make sure to click here or hit the link in the description to get your hands on all 350 of these famous chord MIDIs for free. And if you stick around to the end, I'll show you a bonus on how to create melodies off of these chord progressions. Alright, so I'm sure you all know the importance of chord progressions. They're often the harmonic backbone that makes your song connect on an emotional level to the listener. But it can be really challenging to make your own chord progressions from scratch, especially if you're not super versed in music theory or play an instrument. That's exactly why we've created this resource. So let's jump into these methods on how you can turn these famous chord progressions into your own, starting off with changing the rhythm. The simplest change you can make is to take a pre-existing chord progression and just change the rhythm at which those chords play. For example, we can take Heroes by Alesso, which sounds like this, and experiment with a rhythmic change to give the chord progression a whole new feel. Let's experiment and play around with that for a sec. There are really no rules here, but what I like to do as a starting point is remove the original rhythm of the chord progression and create something completely unique on my own, making sure that each chord change happens in the same place it happened in the original chord progression. Now let's take a listen to this altered version of the Heroes chord progression with a different rhythm. The rhythmic change here has given our progression a much different feel, with a lot more groove and swing to it. And if you're ever stuck on what rhythms to choose, you can always pull a rhythm from a different chord progression. Let's say we really liked the rhythm of the chords in Calvin Harris's We Found Love. What I'll do to create a guide is copy the top note of all of the chord changes and paste that into the MIDI file of the chord progression we're working on and just mute it. This way I can line up all of my chord changes and make sure I'm not messing up the rhythm. Now we can listen to taking this We Found Love rhythm and applying it to our original Heroes chord progression. The options are pretty limitless here, which brings us into our second way of manipulating these famous chord progressions to make your own, and that's adding passing chords. A passing chord is simple enough to understand. It's just a chord that connects or passes between the notes of 2 chords in your progression. It's a lot easier to just see this in action to understand it. Let's say our starting point is using the chord progression from the song Latch by Disclosure. What's really convenient about this pack is we've added Roman numeral analysis to all the progressions, so identifying passing chords is really easy. We can see that this progression is written in A minor, and it is a 1 minor chord followed by a 6 major chord, a 3 major chord, and then a 7 major chord. It sounds like this. In order to add a passing chord, I just have to experiment with what chord could I add in between any 2 of these chords. So in this particular example, I think it would sound really cool to add a chord in between the 2nd chord here, which is a major 6 chord, and the 3rd chord, which is a major 3 chord. Because we're going between the 3 and the 6 chord, there are really only 2 options, the 4 or the 5. Both of these could be really interesting passing chords. So let's play around with using the 5, which is a G major in this scale. We could even add another passing chord later on in the progression, but maybe this time instead we go between the 1 and the 6 chord. We have a lot more options here, but let's just try the 5 chord again. You can get pretty fancy with passing chords, but it's a great way to subtly add variation to a pre-existing chord progression. Next, we have the use of inversions, and specifically different voicings of a pre-existing chord progression. The way the notes of a chord are distributed by the hands across a keyboard dramatically impacts the feel and emotion of that chord. You could technically play the right chords, but they could sound wrong. This is because how you voice them determines the mood and feeling of the song. Take, for instance, the song Where You Are by John Summit. If we play those chords in their original position, here's what it sounds like. The particular voicing and order of the notes of these chords is creating a certain emotional response for the listener. We can manipulate that by changing the inversions and voicings of these chords. What I like to do is just experiment with shifting notes up and down an octave until I've created a completely different inversion. What you can do in most DAWs is a key command. For instance, in Ableton, you can click Shift and up on the arrow keys, and that'll shift notes up and down an octave. I'm just going to play around with this chord progression for a bit, changing notes up and down an octave and rearranging the voicings until we get a different feel for the chord progression. My biggest piece of advice here is to make sure you're using smooth voice leading. You can think of each note within a chord as having a partner note in the next chord. You want to make sure that jumping from note to note, you're not jumping too many pitches up or down. When doing so, it can sound awkward and not be what a piano player would do if they were playing, which is what our ears are most tuned to hearing. This can kind of sound, for lack of a better word, wrong. So listen to the new feel we got just by implementing these chord inversions. You can take this one step further by creating additional variations over time. So let's just say the first part of our progression, we wanted it to stay exactly how we just created it, but then we wanted to alter the voicings to kind of create a different vibe the second time through. Maybe we bring that down an octave, this down an octave, the final note down an octave, and now we have a kind of a different cadence the second half of the progression. So all the way through, the full cadence would sound like this. You can see that just manipulating the intervals and the voicings can make a drastic impact on the feeling of the progression. Now, you might find yourself wanting to actually incorporate extensions and alterations to a progression, which is another way to manipulate these famous chord progressions. This basically just means adding notes that weren't otherwise there to make more complicated chords. Let's take as a starting point the song Like an Animal by Rufus Du Sol. The chord progression is pretty simple, and in my experience, when you're adding alterations and extensions, you want to start with a pretty simple progression because when you add too many notes, it can make the harmony kind of convoluted. This particular progression is written in A minor, and there's only 3 notes in every single chord, so there's a lot of room to experiment. Because we're in A minor, any white note added to any of these chords could create a more interesting chord flavor that we could play with. Let's take a listen to the original progression and then play around with adding some notes to make it more interesting. First thing I'm going to do is play with just adding a couple of 7th notes to some of these chords. Let's hear what that sounds like. And I'm hearing kind of a little bit of a falling note here that might sound cool, connecting the F to the D. And I'm kind of hearing, instead of a D here, going down to a C. Maybe we go back to the E at the start of the progression again, back down to a D, And then maybe for this, we just retain the original E as the top note and maybe add back in a D on the very last note. Let's go ahead and hear what this full progression now sounds like. Very easy, very simple to do. As long as you know which notes are within the scale you're working in, you just need to play around with adding more notes. The fun part about music theory is that technically we are changing chords, we are making these more complicated, but you really just need to listen with your ears and decide what you like. This is also where you could play with adding a couple of these strategies all at once. If you're already changing notes, why not mess around with inversions at the same time? Maybe we grab all of these notes and bring them down an octave. Maybe we even play with changing the key of this particular one. Sounds pretty awesome to me. Another great way to make these chord progressions your own is by simply changing the order of the chords. This might not seem like a lot, but the order at which chords play dramatically impacts their feeling in a composition. Let's take, for example, the chord progression from the song Clarity by Zedd. Now, what I like to do in situations like this with a really long chord progression is just simplify it. Most of the chord changes are happening just in this first little clip right here. And from there, what I like to do is I'll actually just audition a couple of different chord progressions that might make sense. And the way I audition that is simply by dragging my mouse over the notes with this little headphone symbol enabled right here. In Ableton, this allows the sound to come out when I travel over the MIDI note. This allows me to hear what potential chord variations could sound cool, different orders of these chords. So I'm gonna play around a little bit and see if I can come up with an order that I think sounds really nice. So I really like that cadence, followed by this cadence. Cool little variation, all of the same chords. So now what I'll do is I'll just recreate this. So what I like to do to be able to compare it to the original is I'll actually duplicate the MIDI. A good tip here is to actually take all of your chords and make them a lot shorter. That way you can really easily move them to the correct position and it doesn't get in the way of the other chords, which might be longer or getting cut off somehow. From here, it's pretty easy to reorder these chords the way you want and create that new cadence just by reordering the chords. Again, there are really just a lot of ways you can change these chord progressions, and because of those Roman numerals, it makes it even easier to know exactly what it is that you're creating. Now, the sixth method I want to share is to display the chords in different ways. What this means is basically taking a chord and changing the way it's arranged in the piece of music so that it has a different feel. The most common example of this would be to take something that's in a block chord position, meaning just a sustained chord, and turn it into an arpeggiation. Let's take, for instance, the song Sorry by Justin Bieber and Skrillex. The chords are in block formation and they sound like this. But it would sound really cool if these arpeggiated. Each one of these chords has 4 notes, so we could create very simple arpeggiation patterns. I've gone ahead and created one right here. can also use arpeggiation MIDI tools in your DAW, but I like to create them in MIDI to have complete control. And then with a little bit of processing, you can make a really different vibe that completely separates itself from the original chord progression just by arpeggiating through these chords. Take a listen to what this sounds like with a little bit of processing and reverb. Creates a really sick vibe for us to work off of. From here, I could add a bass line, add a drum groove, experiment with melodies, and create a fun little idea, all from that original famous chord progression as a starting point. Now, the last thing I wanted to show you as a bonus are my best practices for creating melodies over these chord progressions. Now, writing melodies is a huge topic, and it probably deserves its own video, but there are some practices you can walk away from today that make melody writing a little bit easier with a pack like this. One of the easiest things you can do is have a solid starting point for your melodic idea. We can grab this chord progression from Don't You Worry Child by Swedish House Mafia as a good starting point. What I'll do next is extract the melody from the song, put it up an octave, that way we can hear the chords against the melody as two separate things. There are just a couple of simple concepts we can go over that will really help you understand why some melodies are more effective than others. The three that I want to touch on are using chord tones, stepwise motion, and rhythmic variation. Just for the sake of this example, I'm going to go ahead and transpose everything into C, just so it's really easy to see what we're doing because we're only going to be using white notes. The first chord in the progression is a G, D, B. GBD is a G chord. The combination of the two notes at the bottom and the lead melody tone here create that full G chord sound. That's effectively just a chord, even though we're getting this kind of interval with a melody on top. Chord tones are any note within that chord. So in this case, the G and the D are essentially making up the G chord here, and the B sounds good because a B is inside of that G major chord. If we were to play a note that's outside of the G major chord, it might rub a little bit more dissonant, like for instance, C. So the idea here with your melodies is that if you stick to chord tones, it's almost guaranteed that your melody line is going to sound good with whatever your chords are below it. You can also use tones from extensions or variations of these chords. So GBD are the first three notes in a G major chord, but we could do a G sus chord by adding in an E note. Sounds pretty pleasant. The next idea is to use stepwise motion, which basically just means stepping between notes using notes within the scale. The original progression does this really well, going from A to B to C, and then later going from C to G to E. We're stepping down or stepping up to get to the next note. This is something you can use in any of your progressions. And lastly, rhythmic variation. There isn't a ton of rhythmic variation in this particular progression. The melody pretty much just follows the rhythm of the chords, but we could certainly introduce some of that when we manipulate this to make it our own. Now, a lot of melody writing is taking the time to just listen and determine what you like, but implementing these three strategies is a guaranteed way to make sure your melodies fit with whatever your chord progression and the rhythm of those chords are. Take a listen to the melody we ended up creating on top of this famous chord progression. I've mostly taken advantage of using chord tones in this melody. Pretty much every single note you hear fits within the chord beneath it, and I've also taken advantage of a lot of rhythmic variation. I have all these cool, interesting trill moments where the note kind of stutters to get to the next phrase, which I thought was very interesting compared to the original melody in Don't You Worry Child. And I'm still taking advantage of things like stepwise motion at the end of the phrase here to climb down from the C to the A, crossing through the B note. Where this really starts to shine is when you hear it in the context of a full idea. Now that I've written this melody, I can pull it out of the chord progression and put it on its own instrument. Once I've fleshed out an idea, it sounds like this. So not only can these 350 famous chord progressions be a great inspiration for your chords, they can also help with your melody and full-on songwriting. Be sure to take a look at our Hyperbits masterclass, where we go in depth into all of these topics and give you every tool you need to make music that sounds as good, if not better, than all of your favorite artists. Using these 6 methods alongside our 350 famous chord progressions resource can be an incredible way to jumpstart your next track. I encourage you to experiment and let us know what other techniques you find yourself using by leaving a comment below. And remember, make sure to snag these MIDI files right away. Happy producing.